Came home on a Tuesday night 3 weeks before Christmas, and my house smelled like someone else's cooking. Not bad, exactly. Just wrong. Garlic and something sweet, maybe a roast, the kind of smell that means someone spent the whole afternoon in a kitchen they felt comfortable in. I stood in the doorway with my work bag still on my shoulder and my keys in my hand, and I just breathed it in, trying to figure out why it felt so off. I'm a charge nurse at a level 2 trauma center. I do 12-hour overnight shifts 4 nights a week. My husband, I'll call him by what he was, my husband, he'd been out of work for 7 months by then. We'd agreed he would handle things at home while he figured out his next step. That was the deal. I bring in the income, he keeps the house running, keeps our daughter Zoe fed and bathed and in bed by 8. Zoe was 5. I dropped my bag by the door and walked into the kitchen. My husband was at the stove, laughing at something his cousin Becca had just said. Becca was sitting at my kitchen table with her 2 boys, Tyler and Caden, who were 8 and 6, both of them making a mess of the placemats I'd bought at Target last spring. The roast was in the center of the table, already carved. The good plates were out. The white ones with the scalloped edges I saved for holidays. I said, "Hey." I said it the way you say it when you're trying to buy yourself a second to process what you're seeing, before you say anything you can't take back. My husband turned around and smiled like nothing was strange at all. "You're home early." I wasn't. I was exactly on time. I knew that because I texted him 20 minutes before I left the hospital, the same way I always did. I looked around the kitchen. "Where's Zoe?" He glanced at Becca. Something small and quick passed between them. She was tired. She went to bed. It was 6:15. I put my keys on the counter and went down the hall to Zoe's room. The door was closed. I opened it slowly, the way you do when a child is sleeping, and I stood there in the dark for a moment, letting my eyes adjust. She wasn't in her bed. I turned on the light. The room was empty. Her stuffed rabbit was on the floor, one ear bent under it like it had been dropped in a hurry. I picked it up without thinking about it and went back into the hall. I checked the bathroom. I checked her bedroom. I went back through the living room, past the kitchen where my husband was saying something to Becca in a low voice, and I opened the door to the garage. Zoe was sitting on the floor between the recycling bins and the wall, wrapped in a fleece blanket that I recognized from the hall closet. She had her drawing notebook in her lap and a crayon in her hand, but she wasn't drawing. She was just sitting. She looked up at me when the door opened, and her face did something that I don't have a word for, even now. It was the face of a child who had been waiting for a long time but had stopped expecting anyone to come. "Mama," she said. I got down on the floor with her. I pulled her into my lap and just held her. She didn't cry. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "Tyler took my markers. Daddy said to go play somewhere quiet." I sat there on the cold garage floor with my daughter in my arms, and I made a decision. I didn't go back into the kitchen and start a fight. I didn't yell. I kissed Zoe on the top of her head and told her I was home. Told her we were going to go get her pajamas on, and I carried her inside. I walked past the kitchen without looking at anyone in it. I gave Zoe a bath, I brushed her teeth, I read her 2 chapters of the book we'd been working through together, and I stayed with her until she fell asleep. It took 40 minutes. Becca and my husband hopped and laughed the entire time. The boys stayed until almost 9. I waited until the house was quiet. My husband came to bed around 10. He was in a good mood. He talked about Becca, how she was going through a hard time since her ex had stopped paying child support, how it helped her to get out of the apartment, how the boys needed a stable environment. He said this with the easy confidence of someone who has never once had to think about where the mortgage payment comes from. I said, "Zoe was in the garage." He said she'd been fine. She just didn't want to share the living room. I said, "She was in the garage, alone, on the floor, for how long?" He said he didn't know. Maybe an hour. She had her blanket. I didn't say anything else. I lay in the dark and I thought about the look on her face when that door opened. And I started to understand that I had been misreading the situation for a long time. The next morning, I called my older sister, Faye. Faye is a paralegal, and she's never once in her life told me what I wanted to hear instead of what I needed to hear, which is one of the things I love about her. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which is also rare for her. When I finished, she said, "How long has Becca been coming over?" I didn't know exactly. I thought about it. 3 months, maybe. She'd started dropping by in the fall, always when I was at work, always with the boys. My husband had mentioned it in passing a few times, just as background information, the way you mentioned the weather. Faye said, I need you to do something for me. Tonight, before anything else, I need you to log into your joint checking account and your savings. And I need you to look at every transaction from the last 6 months and write down anything you don't recognize. I almost told her she was being dramatic. I'm glad I didn't. That evening, after my husband took Becca's boys to a movie, his idea, presented to me as a favor to a struggling single mom, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and I started going through our finances. We had a joint checking account that our household expenses ran through, and a savings account I'd been building for 4 years, ever since Zoe was born. I'd been putting away between $800 and $1,200 every month. Automatic transfer, same day every pay period. I hadn't looked at the balance in a while because I knew what it should be and I trusted the automation. The savings account had $11,000 in it. It should have had somewhere between $42,000 and $45,000. I sat very still for what felt like a long time. Then I started clicking through transactions. The withdrawals had started in March. Small at first, 500 here, 800 there. By June, they were running 2,000 and 3,000 at a time. The checking account told a different story. I found charges I didn't recognize at a jewelry store in the next town over. A weekend hotel charge in Portland, 3 separate charges at a restaurant I'd never been to. I found a charge for flowers twice and I'd never received flowers. I took screenshots of everything. I made a spreadsheet. I did not call my husband. I called Faye. She gave me the name of a family law attorney, a woman named, I'll just call her my attorney because her privacy matters more than the story, and I had an appointment the next morning. My attorney was calm and practical and she did not let me spiral. She explained that because the funds had been marital assets, recovery was possible but required documentation, and that my first priority was to separate the accounts before anything else was moved. She told me not to discuss finances with my husband, not to indicate that I'd seen anything unusual, and under no circumstances to confront Becca or engage with her directly. I want to be clear, I listened to my attorney. Every piece of advice she gave me, I followed. I know that sounds simple. It wasn't. Over the next 2 weeks, I gathered everything she asked for. I photographed bank statements. I documented the hotel charge and cross-referenced the date with a weekend my husband had told me he was helping his brother move. His brother, who later told me, when I asked carefully and indirectly, that he hadn't seen my husband in months. I found a credit card in my husband's name that I hadn't known existed, linked to a P.O. box. The balance was just over $8,000. I opened a separate account at a different bank. I rerouted my direct deposit. I did this quietly. Over the course of a Thursday afternoon, while my husband was at a gym class he'd started taking with Becca's boys as his companions. The gym was 40 minutes away. My attorney filed the separation papers on a Wednesday. My husband didn't find out until a process server came to the house the following Monday morning. I had spent that weekend at my sister Faye's house with Zoe. I told my husband I needed a long weekend to decompress from a hard stretch at work. He hadn't questioned it. He'd seemed almost relieved. When he called me after the papers were served, he wasn't calm. He cycled through confusion, then anger, then something that sounded almost like grief, though I've thought about it since and I think it was closer to panic. He said he could explain. He said Becca needed help. He said I was blowing this out of proportion. He said Zoe was fine, Zoe was always fine, I was being dramatic. I let him talk. When he was done, I said, my attorney will be in contact with yours. Please don't call this number again. And I hung up. I know people think that moment is supposed to feel powerful, like a movie, like you finally slam the door and the music swells. It didn't feel like that. It felt like standing at the end of a very long hallway and realizing you've been walking toward the exit for longer than you knew. The next few months were not clean or simple. I want to say that because stories like mine often get told as if they move in a straight line and they don't. There were nights at Faye's house when Zoe woke up crying and I couldn't explain to her in any terms she could understand why we weren't home. There were mornings I sat in my car in the hospital parking garage for 10 minutes before I could make myself go inside. There were moments when the only thing that got me through a shift was knowing that Zoe was safe, that she was with Faye, that whatever else was broken, that one thing was solid. My attorney was thorough. The financial forensics were straightforward once you knew where to look. My husband had been funneling money to Becca, not secretly, exactly, but just quietly enough that I hadn't noticed while I was working nights and sleeping days and trusting the life I'd built to stay where I'd left it. The hotel charge, the jewelry, the restaurant. None of it had been for Becca as a cousin in need. My attorney didn't have to tell me that. I'd figured it out weeks before she laid it out in a document. The separation agreement took 4 months to finalize. I was awarded the house. I chose to sell it. I didn't want it. I wanted to give Zoe a room she had never had to share, in a home where she would never be sent to wait in a garage. We moved into an apartment in February. It has 3 bedrooms, which is 2 more than we need, but I wanted Zoe to have a room that was entirely, undeniably hers. She decorated it herself, which mostly meant she taped drawings to the walls at 5-year-old height and arranged her stuffed animals in a very specific order that I have been instructed never to disturb. The rabbit from the garage is on the top shelf. She put it there herself. My husband had hired a lawyer who specialized in mediation over litigation, which told my attorney and me something about how confident he was in his position. The financial records were not in his favor. He returned a portion of what had been taken, not all of it because some of it was, as his attorney argued, jointly spent, which is a phrase that made me want to put my head through a wall, but enough that the settlement landed somewhere livable. Becca did not come out of this without consequences either. Because some of the funds had passed through accounts in her name, there was a separate civil matter that my attorney referred to a colleague who handled that kind of work. I didn't follow it closely, I didn't need to. I had enough to manage on my own side. Here is what I want to say about the people who knew. My mother-in-law called me twice after the separation. She did not call to apologize or to check on Zoe. She called to tell me that her son was struggling, that he had made mistakes, that family was worth fighting for. I let her finish both times. I said, I understand. I did not explain or justify or ask her to see my side. There was no version of that conversation that would have ended well, and I knew it, and I chose not to start it. My husband's brother, the one he claimed to be helping when he was in Portland, he texted me once, I didn't know. I'm sorry. I texted back, I know. Take care of yourself. That was enough. Faye never said I told you so. Not once. She said it before, in her way, when she asked me how long Becca had been coming over. She didn't need to say it again. The people I work with, my colleagues, the nurses I've spent 12-hour overnight shifts with for 6 years, they knew something was wrong before I said a word. Nurses always know. Sheila, who's been in the ER for 20 years and has the emotional radar of someone who has seen every possible human situation, brought me coffee one morning without being asked and just sat with me in the break room for 6 minutes and didn't say anything, and somehow that was exactly right. Zoe asks about her dad sometimes. I answer honestly in terms a 5-year-old can hold. Daddy and I don't live together anymore. Daddy made some choices that hurt our family. You are loved. You are safe. You did nothing wrong. I say those things in different orders on different days, depending on what she needs. I will keep saying them for as long as she needs to hear them. I went back to school this fall. Part-time, online, working toward a BSN. It's slow, and on the nights I come home from a 12-hour shift and sit down to do coursework at 11 p.m. I sometimes question every decision I've made in the last 2 years. But then I think about what I want Zoe to see when she watches me move through the world. I think about what I want her to understand about what a woman does when something is taken from her. She doesn't perform, she documents, she finds a good attorney. She reroutes her direct deposit. She takes her daughter to her sister's house for a long weekend, and she doesn't explain herself to anyone who doesn't deserve an explanation. And then she builds something that belongs only to her. There's a night I keep coming back to, not the night I found Zoe in the garage, though I think about that too, more than I like. But a night about 2 months after we moved into the apartment. Zoe had had a hard day at kindergarten, some falling out with a friend, the kind of drama that is completely catastrophic at 5 and completely invisible from the outside. I'd given her a bath and we were lying in her bed together. Her stuffed animals arranged around us in the specific order that must not be disturbed, and she said out of nowhere, "Mama, do you like our apartment?" I said I did. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "Me too. It smells like us." I didn't say anything. I just pulled her a little closer. She was right. It did. For the first time and longer than I could track, the place I came home to smelled exactly like it was supposed to. I've thought a lot about cause and effect since all of this happened. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way people talk about the universe balancing things out, but in the plain, unglamorous way that life actually works. You make choices, and those choices have weight, and eventually that weight lands somewhere. My husband made his choices across months, quietly, in a house he didn't pay for, and they landed exactly where they had to. What gets me, what I still sit with, is how long I didn't see it because I was too busy building the thing he was quietly dismantling. I worked nights. I tracked our savings in the back of my mind, the way you track a slow drip in the ceiling. Not urgently, just aware. And that awareness, that trust in the automation of my own life was exactly what he counted on. That's not me blaming myself. I want to be clear about that. The fault is not mine. But I learned something from it that I think about almost every day now. Intelligence without attention is just potential. I'm a charge nurse. I read situations for a living. I assess, I triage, I make calls under pressure. And I miss this because I applied that same sharpness only where I expected to need it. At work, in the ER where danger announces itself. Not at home. Not where I thought I was safe. Zoe in the garage was the moment that broke the spell. Not the money, though the money mattered. Not the hotel charge or the jewelry or the phone calls I later pieced together. It was my daughter's face when that door opened. The face of a child who had stopped expecting rescue. 5 years old and already learning to wait quietly and not ask for too much. That was the consequence of his choices made visible, and I understood in that moment that staying would mean letting her learn that lesson all the way through. I didn't leave because I was angry. I left because I was clear, and that clearness, that is something I had to build inside myself, not something that arrived on its own. It came from Faye asking me hard questions I didn't want to hear. It came from my attorney being practical when I wanted to be emotional. It came from 12-hour overnight shifts surrounded by people who hold it together under actual pressure and taught me by example that you can feel something completely and still act correctly. That's what I want to pass on to Zoe, not as a speech, not someday in some formal conversation, but just through the way she sees me move. That you can be devastated and disciplined at the same time. That the most important thing you'll ever do is pay attention to your finances, to your child's face, to the feeling that something is off in a house that should smell like yours but doesn't. That integrity isn't a personality trait. It's a series of decisions made quietly when no one is watching and nothing is easy. My husband's world didn't collapse because the universe punished him. It collapsed because every choice he made was built on something borrowed. Borrowed money, borrowed time, borrowed time. Structures like that don't hold. They never do. He is living with the weight of that now, and I think about it less and less each month. I'm in school. I'm raising Zoe. Our apartment smells like us. That's enough. That is more than enough.